except in a formal sense, if you want. What do you mean by the real? I mean the paraphernalia of democracy, full period elections, prime ministers and so on and so on. Well, the elections are very important. No. Elections are important provided they produce really good men. So democracy will not work. For the simple reason we have got a social structure which is totally incompatible with parliamentary democracy. What do you mean that it's based on equality, inequality, or it is based on inequality? The alternative, as I think, is some kind of communism.
Within Indians, within the history of India, what is the counter-revolutionary trend that Ambedkar debates with within the religious terrain itself, such that you can actually separate the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary within the religious terrain? Yeah, this is something Ambedkar, this contestation or this debate Ambedkar undertakes with Tilak. This is something which is very important, and you people know about it more than me probably. That Tilak is his is crucial. Gandhi, of course, is there, but actually on the ideological question, Tilak is the more direct adversary. So I'm not going to go into the details of the ideological debates, but I'm going to actually highlight something I've done in my book already, but I'll just do it again. Highlight a particular form of articulation that Ambedkar resorts to when he is discussing Tilak in the light of Tilak's reading of the Gita. In his text, Krishna and his Gita, Ambedkar's text, Krishna and his Gita. And here, in the light of how Tilak reads the Gita, Ambedkar says something very cryptic. Ambedkar says that Tilak would both like to give Gita a certain autonomous status, that Gita is, in that sense, very close to kind of revelation. It is not subject to history. Though it is a text, and hence it is part of history, and yet it contains a truth or contains some kind of some sort of a validity which is, again, transcendent. But at the same time, Tilak knows that any counter-revolutionary historical text owes a debt to revolution. So he uses this form of this figure of speech. He says, counter-revolution owes a debt to revolution, and this counter-revolution does not like. So counter-revolution would like to somehow make you forget the debt of the revolution. This is what Ambedkar says. That if there was no revolution, then there would be no counter-revolution. But counter-revolution would want to exist as if there was no revolution. But that is absurd, because if there was no revolution, there would be no counter-revolution. What's the sense of counter-revolution if there were no revolution? But the very fact that there was a revolution itself is something counter-revolution would want you to forget. This is the kind of historical amnesia that you want to inject or force. That is a very central political, practical political, but also with even greater charge, a kind of catharsis. You want to do a historical catharsis. You want to make the historical society or historical people totally evacuate the memory of revolution, such that you come to a state of, we were discussing Rasad the last time, a certain state of nothingness. Counter-revolution is built as if history starts all over again. The trauma, even the excitement There was a word Kant used for revolution, enthusiasm. That emotion, all those emotions are completely, to again come back to the theatre concept, are completely evacuated. They are the subjects of a catharsis. And you are at a state of nothingness, a kind of peace. So a kind of caricatural Buddhism is there, actually, even with counter. It's a caricatural Buddhism, but it is there, as if there is nothing, there is nothingness, on which now society will come. And yet the contradiction is, counter-revolution speaks always in terms of the past. You see, either it could have said all the past, now you forget. Now you start all over again. But no, every time counter-revolution goes, and this is what Ambedkar says with regard to Tilak, that what is Tilak doing? Tilak is actually saying that there is a past which is even before the mere known past. There is a golden past. There is a greater past. But at the same time, the continuity from past to present is broken. And to that extent, it is a strange kind of a prescription that a part of the past you must forget. But the past before the past, which is actually forgotten, must be brought back. This is the trouble with counter-revolution. The part of the past which is the only past you remember must be forgotten. And the part that has been forgotten must be remembered. And then history must be rebuilt. So the only way to somehow make sense of this historically incoherent logic is again to resort to theology. That is, that past which is forgotten is not a historical past, but something which has a kind of transcendence, which has a kind of immemorial reality. That is the only way you can. So the word that Ambedkar highlights in the context of Gandhi also, Sanatan. The word Sanatan. Sanatan is Sanatan. It's immemorial. It's always present. You might have forgotten what is Sanatan. Maybe the Sanatan no human being remembers or has any sense of, any consciousness of at a particular time. But the Sanatan remains. It's a kind of eternal remaining. And at some point it comes back to consciousness. But it is not subject to death, the law of death. It is only a question of sinking into oblivion and rising into consciousness. Just this movement. But it does not in itself, it's almost, this idea of Sanatan and the idea of the soul have a kind of, what Krishna, in the Gita, in the discourses has been said, something which doesn't tear, something which doesn't wear down, it doesn't get affected by heat or by fire or air, and so on and so forth. So that kind of permanence. But at the same time, you must bring that permanence into historical consciousness to make it the principle of practical government, which is counter-revolutionary politics. So this is something which in Tilak we see. But precisely because you must make this Sanatan principle a principle which is also modern, part of contemporary politics, Ambedkar shows you that Tilak reads the Gita through Karma Yoga, through Karma, the idea of Karma, as different from, say, Shankara's reading of Gita, which is a kind of Gyan, goes towards Gyan. And Tilak more and more highlights Karma. So a very interesting modern philosophical problem arises, in that sense linking the European tradition of revolution and counter-revolution, or the debate, contestation of counter-revolution, revolution, to that particular conjuncture when Ambedkar is writing about or writing vis-a-vis Tilak or even Gandhi or others. And that is the notion of the individual free act, the act. That's action is not anymore the result of any particular agency or any particular force or source which is outside the human self. Action is an action always built on freedom. The subject, so a notion of the subject. So politics is action, art is action, love is action, because they are all acts of freedom. So that is a modern aura of the subject, a kind of evocation. Aura without an aura. That is not the aura of something transcendental, not a religious aura, but the very idea of the individual, the liberal aura of the individual. The subject who can act and make a form of life for oneself. So the notion of karma apparently evokes the same kind of modern idea of act. And Tilak, while on the one hand speaking of this past, the great past, actually, unlike Gandhi, doesn't speak of it religiously that much. He speaks of it as a kind of great golden past, immemorial, but actually also lodged in a certain superior racial people, a larger racial people, a superior people, who also are not specifically located in the geographical limits of India anymore, but who go back to, and Tilak had a very strange theory about the Arctic region from where the true Indian population came, as a long history of migration. So it is not actually apparently religious, but the Gita provides, interestingly, a theory of act which comes from religion, but at the same time gives you a sense of this karma, which is also in a more modern, secular, and within the colonial context, also Westernist idea of the free act of the individual or through the individual collective. Both these things actually happen together. So I'm not going to go into the argument, but just give you the conclusion. Ambedkar shows, or tries to show, in his long but unfinished text. So we must also remember all these texts, many of these texts are unfinished. So Counter-Revolution and Revolution, Riddles of Hinduism, particularly Counter-Revolution and Revolution, these are not completed projects. Marx and Buddha, again, is not a full book. It is only a lecture that we get. So these are unfinished. So we must keep that in mind. Anyway, so what does Ambedkar conclude? He says, actually, this whole thing is a mask. This whole thing is actually a certain kind of ideological mystification behind the ideology of the free act, or the act which in Tilak's reading the Gita espouses, and in a sense, in a poetic form, really affects you with, as a kind of, again, a rasa. Behind that ideological mystification through also aesthetic mechanisms, there is a very clear project, a politico-ideological project. And that is the project of not karma, but karma-kand. This is what Ambedkar says. The karma in Tilak is karma-kand. And it belongs to the history of the reading of Gita, of course, but the reading of Gita, where duties are part of the Varna duties, is something which is mentioned by different people, and the idea of Varna and Guna, because Gita actually is a critique of Varna, you know that, of course. It is towards the Guna that Krishna actually moves, but it retains the same homologous structure, the same hierarchical structure of different types of acts of different gunas. The classificatory form is the same of Varna, but it is not a Varna system. Its factual basis is not apparently Varna in Gita, but it has the same structure. This is what Ambedkar shows. And he says because it is not Varna, or it's a critique of Varna, Tilak seems to say that, look, what we get from Gita is a kind of a theory of duty or karma being performed at the level of something like a free subject. Freed from, so conscience, it's an almost modernistic idea, that conscience, which is something which is your thing, which is your responsibility, will make you performing duty, not the Varna Dharma, on the one hand. But at the same time, this idea of karma is still rooted in a theory of guna. And the theory of guna is already prescribed a typology of which is what, which is tama, which is raja, which is what. Already. So if it's already classified, then the question of the free act as an existential act cannot arise. Hence, it is in a secular form cloaked karmakand, ritual. It's ritualized act. Even if not based on varna, on guna, it's still ritualized. This is the logic that through Tilak you get through a reading of the Gita, which helps you then to apparently reconcile the two sides. On the one hand, the modern idea of the individual, on the other, freed of varna, but on the other hand, the idea of an obligatory, liturgical, habitual, repetitive karmakanda, ritual act. So, I have written about this. It might be a controversial topic or not, maybe it's a settled matter, but when the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was started many years back, now it seems such a long time back, I wrote about Swachh Bharat as what I called a production of ritual citizenship. So it's a citizen's duty. And this is nothing to do with how effective or not effective the Abhiyan itself is. That's a different matter. But the thought of the Abhiyan produces a ritual citizenship. So the idea of citizen is the idea of a free space of the act. Because the whole Swachh Bharat is built on act, on a practical duty. But on the other hand, the very idea of Swachh is already an idea of ritual cleanliness or ritual cleansing. So this particular word Swachh has always intrigued me. Why is it not Saf? And why is it also not Shuddh? Swachh is a very strategically chosen word. Neither is it Saf nor is it Shuddh. It's Swachh. So it retains a certain kind of civic meaning that is accessible to citizens' consciousness. Shuddha wouldn't do that. Shuddha would immediately produce religious ritual idea. And Saf would make it completely banal, instrumental. Swachh gives you a sense of a kind of purposiveness, which is a civic purposiveness. But at the same time, Swachh also carries a certain connotation of cleanliness on a ritual scale. And that is something, probably, whoever thought of it was a very smart person, because it is effective, no doubt. So to that extent, a kind of ritual citizenship. So Ambedkar, in a way, is talking of Tilak's reading of Gita as the basis, not of citizenship, because citizenship doesn't arise at that time, but as a kind of strange kind of ritual, and in that sense karmakand, but at the same time, something which still can form the basis of a modern individualistic idea of the civic, a kind of civic individual, rather than the religious subject. But the problem is that while Tilak is doing this, and it, as I'm saying, from then to now, we can see a whole ongoing project here. But at the same time, Tilak is also someone who is part of that counter-revolutionary syndrome, that counter-revolution hates the fact that it owes a debt to the revolution. What does that mean? It means that insofar as counter-revolution keeps referring to the other of counter-revolution, someone else, someone who is an enemy, someone who you must be careful about, someone who must not be allowed to infiltrate, you are also immediately reminding everyone that counter-revolution is fighting something which is actually the reason why counter-revolution exists at all. So in the case of Gita, it is Buddhism. It is not necessarily by the name Buddhism, but in the ideas, in the conceptual, in the conceptual distinctions. So one of the questions of the karma, in the questions of karma, in the reading of Gita, what you find is this again, this strange contradiction that you have a theory of the soul which says that to kill is something which is not significant because the soul does not die. Kind of theory of indifference of the soul to death. So Arjun, in a way, neutralizes Krishna neutralizes Arjun's emotions by this logic. So up to here, apparently there is a kind of neutralization. You are kind of on ground zero. That nothing really, you are indifferent. It's a question of indifferent. But then we still don't know what makes Arjun act. Because we know why Arjun's doubts have apparently a certain philosophically or metaphysically a wrong basis. That Krishna is arguing, fine. But what will make Arjun still fight the war? This is the part which remains a problem. Because we are not simply interested in neutralizing his doubts. We are also finally interested in making him fight the fight. Here Ambedkar says, again the question of karma comes back. Is Arjun fighting once he realizes his wrong thinking about the notions of family and all that? Is he fighting out of some other kind of motivation which is self-enlightened in the sense of out of his own knowledge? Is he, to again come back to that main point, is he becoming a subject of choice? Because that is one possibility. If you're indifferent to fighting because the consequences of fighting are not really significant in terms of something which is of a far greater value, which is the soul, then in itself the indifference can become a philosophy. But here, it is not a philosophy which is the point. It is a story. It is a drama. It is staged. Gita is staged. So Ambedkar actually brings out so I've always said Krishna and his Gita is Ambedkar's probably only text where he is a literary critic. He's a literary writer. Because it is a mythical, historical or epic, whatever, narrative drama. And like in any drama, there is a situation, there is something staged. So the battle is a situation. And I'm not saying this completely out of context. 2 years back, or maybe 3 years back, in Haryana, there was a major project on a Gita, the government of Haryana and others, with a lot of corporate support, they initiated a project of Gita, spreading the message of Gita. So it was said, no, it is with today's public, particularly young people, it is not effective enough to spread the word of Gita. What you must do is to produce a visual support for Gita. So what they did was they took an entire space and made an exhibition out of the Gita. So every part of the text was being illustrated by film shots of battles from Hindi films of different kinds of, huge amounts of money were poured in for a kind of visualization of the Gita. Which means Gita is a kind of fiction with truth effects. This is very important for the project of Gita. It's a fiction, it's drama, it's myth, whatever, Mahabharata, but with truth effect. You must produce truth effect. So you can do that through text, you can do that through performance, you can do that through cinema, through images, through anything. Through an exhibition, site. Anyway, so that is something which with the case of Arjun becomes extremely important. That how do we stage Arjun's actions? What is Arjun's motivation? And here the answer is brutal, Ambedkar says. The answer is, when everything has been neutralized, there is only one thing which will lead Arjun to act, which is Kshatriya Dharma. So why will he fight the war? Because it's the Kshatriya's Dharma to fight the war. Though Dharma itself has been neutralized in terms of any kind of particular charge to it, that it is something which is going to lead to some major consequences, good or bad. No. You have rendered it more or less indifferent. But you'll still do it because it is the Dharma. And it's not just Dharma, it is Kshatriya Dharma. So, it's a peculiar strategy where you take away the ideological charge apparently from the entire system of Varna through Guna and all that, and then produce a metaphysical theory which makes the very subject non-existent because of the notion of the soul. And yet you have the reality of the subject, Arjun, right there in front of you, and you have to make him act. And you make him act through a completely mechanical, habitual, ritual version of that very thing which philosophically you had tried to take a distance from, which is caste. This is what Ambedkar shows very forcefully. And people like Tilak actually try to make use of this double article strategy in the Gita, or possibility of, insinuating such a strategy in the Gita. And that, says Ambedkar, is the subterfuge of counter-revolution. Counter-revolution must neutralize, weaken all the excitement, like I said a moment back, all the enthusiasm of great events of the past. Or not great necessarily, which are unambiguously great, but like the French Revolution, something which can be extremely tortuous. So French Revolution was something which was a bloodbath. I mean, it was terrible actually, what happened. So many deaths. And Kant in his text, Conflict of Faculties, says that if someone thinks of the French Revolution, one might feel enthusiasm, but none of the heroes of the French Revolution would ever want to go back to the French Revolution if they had a choice. That is what Kant said. But still, if you think of the French Revolution as an idea, you feel enthusiasm. So in history, ideas arise which are progressive. But the events through which ideas arise are in themselves highly dissatisfactory. So even in history, these two levels must be distinguished. So to that extent, counter-revolution would want to do both. It would both want to completely neutralize or trivialize the event, but it would also like to crush the idea. Both these things. So that, again, to come back to this, you start with a clean slate. But it is not a clean slate. This is Ambedkar's point. The clean slate is filled by ritual. Karmakand. Karmakand, of course, simply means a certain habitual duty, a habitual prescription. And to that extent, the Gita becomes a kind of template or a kind of articulation for a theory of duty, which seems to bring together the ancient idea of caste duty and the modern idea of individual action. But this is not the end of it. The problem is that while all of this is happening, and it is pretty effective, there is no doubt about it, but it is still again and again, whether openly or through oblique means, it is reminding you for the very reason why Gita is written, or Gita exists as a mythico-dramatic philosophical narrative. And Ambedkar says, and that is of course the most provocative thesis, because it's a historical thesis, he says the Gita is written at the time of a particular philosophy of Hindu school of thought, which is a response to Gita with a time lag. So there is a historical period that he gives to it, which is more or less after the first 300 years of the Christian era, while Buddhism existed some 5th century BC or 6th century BC, so with some lag. And this is the time of Purva Mimamsa, of Jaimini's thought. So there is a particular kind of school of thinking which philosophically produces a systematic ideological response to an event which was both a philosophical and a political event, which is Buddhism. Because it is not a philosophical text in the discursive sense, Gita will not ever mention any Buddhist or any other historical reference will not be there. That does not mean that the Gita does not owe debt to the Buddhist revolution, to which it is a counter-revolutionary response. So now, given this ambiguity, the very debt that it owes and the debt that it would like to pretend as if it does not exist, or at least make you think that there is no debt, produces again the paradox which Joseph de Maistre defined in his work on counter-revolution. And Joseph de Maistre said, counter-revolution should not merely be the other of revolution. Counter-revolution must be the opposite of revolution, not merely the reverse of revolution, but the opposite of revolution. So in English language it's a bit confusing. What is the difference between reverse and opposite? But that is the main point, that counter-revolution must be something which must be both what it is and be independent. Must be independent, must be self-originating. There is a word in English, autochthony, born from the earth, not born from time, but born from itself. So clearly the only way you can think about this is revealed religion. The word is language, which is historical, but the word is God's word. So in Christianity you have the Bible, in Islam you have Quran, so in a sense of revelation. So you need it in language, but the language itself is not historico-human. It is God's word. So you need revelation. Only revelation can have this kind of a character, that it is transmitted among humans, and yet it is not human. So the duty is transmitted for people to do. The ritual has to be performed in human spaces, and yet its source itself is something somewhere else. That, again, we are coming back to this mystery of sovereignty. So this particular philosophical knot, this philosophical puzzle, becomes very, very strongly obvious when Joseph de Maistre says that counter-revolution must not be merely the reverse of revolution, it must be the opposite of revolution. What does that mean? It means revolution says that human beings, so it's going back to an obvious point, but one needs to repeat it, human beings are capable of thinking the principles on which they set up their societies. That is, Ambedkar would say, human beings can take responsibility for their social constructions. Their social constructions might be wrong, their principles might be bad, but insofar as it is their principles, human principles, these principles are a question of what could be called self-responsibility. So the other day I spoke of self-conversion. Self-conversion is a strange term because self-conversion means self-responsibility for converting. But converting is always converting to the other. How can you be responsible for the other? This is actually a challenge to Ambedkar from different quarters. Philosophically, you can think of a thinker from Jewish provenance called Emmanuel Levinas. That the other is someone who you cannot be responsible for, but you must be responsible to the other, because you cannot control the other, you cannot capture the other. So responsibility is actually something which is in the absence of any kind of sovereignty of the self. And yet, in Ambedkar, there seems to be a thought of some sort of responsibility which is close to sovereignty of the self, or which is against the sovereignty of some theological, transcendental, mysterious source. Rational. In other words, Ambedkar is a rationalist. And he's saying Buddhism is, in a sense, while it is a particular religion and which we discussed last time, it is a critique of the self, but it is a critique of the illusory self, the egoistic self. It is at the same time, precisely because it is a critique of the illusory self, it is a ground for thinking of collective self-responsibility. This is Ambedkar's great rational thinking about Buddhism. As my friend and colleague Y.S. Alone says, Buddhism is anti-metaphysics. Buddhism is religion without metaphysics. Metaphysics means precisely what it says, a physics beyond physics. That is something somewhere else, a reality somewhere else. No. So that kind of transcendence, metaphysical transcendence, is denied in Buddhism. And Joseph de Maistre and such counter-revolutionary thinkers say that no, we must return the mystery to its true provenance, to its true source. So sovereignty must be returned to a place of its real source, and that source is not merely human. It cannot be captured through human beings. So, I remember an interview, I forget the name, of an Islamic activist, a student activist, long time back in the Hellkite had come. And it was something which intrigued me a lot. Because also with Islam, the question of sovereignty of the Allah is such an important point. So the interviewer asked this person that, in the modern age, democracy is the paradigm. It is the measure. Don't you think, because this person is an Islamist, strong Islamist thinker, I've forgotten the name. He was a student activist at that time. He was a strong Islamist thinker. Don't you think we should, whatever religious freedom we should have, absolutely, everyone. But whatever it might be, this principle of democracy should not become on that there should be agreement, which means sovereignty of the people. And this person answered, he says, absolutely, no question. I mean, as an idea, I completely agree. But suppose factually someone else is the sovereign. Suppose the sovereign is not us, people. Factually, someone else. I mean, that else could be Allah, could be God, whatever. Suppose that is the truth, what to do? Now, for me, it was a very strange thing to read. He says, yeah, I would also I'm completely in agreement with what you're saying. But what to do if the fact is that the sovereignty doesn't lie with us, but somewhere else? Then we have to go by that. Now, this is a moment of impasse, no? Somewhere else which we can't talk about, and at the same time, we are saying somewhere else such that our lives are being determined by somewhere else. And we have to now flounder around and do the best we can in this kind of a weak, kind of what someone called a weak thinking on sovereignty. Not this confident thinking, we have a democracy, we'll make our own world, we'll have principles, like Ambedkar is a very strong thinker of democracy. We'll create our own principle. So no, we must be weak thinkers. Our force, historical being, is a weak being, subject to the sovereignty of that. So in that sense, counter-revolution is also a project of weakening something which weakens the entire domain of politics. Sovereignty is a kind of, counter-revolution is a project of weakening politics. Politics which seems to claim, like revolutionary tradition does, that through politics we can change the world. Marx is one such great thinker, of course. So this is more or less, it seems to me, the landscape, a complex landscape. But the point is, in that landscape, the question of human action as political action, and Ambedkar as someone who was placed in that period as a political subject, has to confront, both theoretically and practically. And very quickly, his own options were of course very rich options, but those options were deeply embroiled in the difficulties of his own time. So insofar as he did take up his position in as a mainstream political subject and wrote the Constitution, he wrote it, like I said, with both hands. He wrote many things together. So in that sense, many organs. But insofar as he was a constitutional thinker, he very clearly spoke in terms of secular politics of principles. That is, historical principles, self-responsibility. That's the one side to it. but the other side to it is that while he spoke of this kind of constitutional self-responsibility in the last part of his life, he also wanted to seem to take a distance from this kind of a national sovereign self-responsibility towards what I'm calling a Buddhist internationalism. But that internationalism is also an internationalism of ideas of values which are universal, which are not really political constitution, but which are more ethical, which have a certain universalism which is more philosophical. So Vaibhav the other day very interestingly pointed towards a philosophical religion, possibility of a philosophical but at the same time internationalist idea of religion, which is Buddhism. So that kind of a movement on both sides we see with Ambedkar, and that is interesting because with Ambedkar, what we find is with these movements of thought, he is at the cusp of something which in Indian history is not really the moment when Dalit politics is created as an autonomous politics or a Dalit movement, but with Neo Buddhism and the formation of the Republican Party, something which is a framework for a politics which is a politics of the subject rather than a politics of citizenship. This is something which seems to me to be very important. While as a constitutional thinker, citizenship is clearly the ground on which he's producing his entire legal thinking and juridical thinking. With Buddhism, it is really a politics of the people. So a kind of Buddhist people, Neo-Buddhist as another name of the people, or another, and in that sense, people not citizens. So people and citizens are not the same. This is, I think, very important to keep in mind, that when he's speaking of Buddhism, he's actually taking a distance from this whole puzzle of citizenship. You know, after the French Revolution, the terror and all that, what is called the Thermidor, 1794, month of July, the Thermidor, the first time the word citizen came to the picture as a central idea. Till then, it was people. It was people. It is only after the first phase of the revolution was over that you have, within the revolution, a notion which was not really the main notion. And the word citizen in French was there, but citizen was understood very differently, not a constitutional citizenship, but citizenship itself as a kind of universal internationalist idea. Citizen of the revolution, not citizen of the country. So this was the idea initially. You were citizen of the revolution. You are not citizen of a country in the sense of a legal citizen, a state citizen. But this actually comes into the picture with, after the terror, 1794, a new constitution is formed, and the word citizen becomes absolutely central. So now you speak of citizenship as the locus of rights and duties. So, in a way, from that moment onwards, the universal amplitude of what is called human rights or universal fundamental rights were already being limited by a certain parameter, which is a national limited parameter of citizenship. So citizenship is actually already, if not a counter-revolutionary idea, definitely a revisionist idea. So, of course, in terms of vocabulary, you have to distinguish between revisionism, counter-revolution, and revolution. So it seems to me, while Ambedkar himself was a great architect of living citizenship through the Indian Constitution, with his Buddhist thought, he was also, in a way, taking a distance from the revisionist possibilities of a limited idea of citizenship. And again, reaffirming the fundamental, universal, revolutionary idea of something which is far more, far closer to the idea of the people as a sovereign or as a sovereign idea, if not a citizen, it's not a governmental sovereign, state sovereign, but a sovereign idea, rather than citizen, which is a more administrative concept. Though he himself, of course, he himself produced great documents on the question of citizenship. There is no doubt about that. But while he did that, he also, with his Buddhist thought, came to a threshold which to me is a greater threshold of fundamental revolutionary idea of generic, I'm using Marx's word here, of generic humanity. Generic egalitarian humanity. So very quickly now, the second part in 10 minutes. So this is yesterday. This is the kind of paradigmatic space of yesterday, politics yesterday. Between then and now, it seems to me we are actually being pulled, we were pulled between these two choices, not choices, but possibilities or tendencies of revisionism and revolutionary thought in the first part of our historical life from 1950s to 1970s. And of course, the Naxalite movement played a great role in a way in affirming the revolutionary question, or what I call the revolutionary hypothesis, in a very forceful way within the history of the left, by breaking away from the undivided Communist Party and then also the Communist Party Marxist CPM, and in a sense tried to force through the method of violence, of course, a certain idea of revolution, which is what they call a rejection, a repudiation of citizenship as a bourgeois idea or as a limited class idea. They did that, no doubt. So that is one direction politics took as a ruptural story within the Indian independent history. But there was something else which happened which was very different, but I think had a similar ruptural effect, which is the Dalit Panthers movement. Not to be at all collapsed with anything else, but its fundamental force of the Dalit Panthers, because its source of its alliances, and Weber has taught me a lot about that, its alliances and its sources and its force field actually takes you to the anti-slavery movement. It takes you towards a different, not the Marxist part of the world, but actually towards America more. That is true. Nevertheless, aside from these things, the fundamental ruptural potential, the revolutionary potential of Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra has, and of course there are also the fact that in Dalit Panthers there is also a tremendous amount of political influence of Marxism. Sharad Patil himself is someone who has written and talked about Marx, Pune, Ambedkar. I mean, all of that is there. But I would still say, apart from getting into all these sources discussion, the point is that Dalit Panthers is a movement which, in a sense, moves towards the pole of what I have called generic humanity, though through a very localized Dalit movement, rather than simply towards the consensual space of citizenship. This is a controversial claim, clearly, because after all, Dalit movements is part of the larger Dalit movement toward Dalit rights, and Dalit rights is part of constitutional activism, no doubt about it. But what I'm talking about is not really only the practical part of it. I'm talking about the principle of it. I'm talking about the thought of it. And to me, the Dalit movement, insofar as it, in the 70s, produces a specific thought of a generic humanity, but based on the very localized intensity of and it is also an aesthetic intensity, because this is the point at which a tremendous amount of new literary innovations are taking place in Maharashtra. At this point, a ruptural possibility arises, which is again moving towards the revolutionary pole rather than the revisionist citizens, the citizen pole. So a politics of the subject rather than a politics of citizenship. But of course, these are not black and white binary choices. So, like I said, the principle is greater, but that doesn't mean the actual practical intervention is not. So, this is very different from Maoism. Because Maoism has a tendency to refuse any kind of intervention at the level of civic politics. That is totally different with Dalit Panthers. So, there is no comparison here at all. But at the level of the amplitude, there is a comparison, which is simply said revolutionary in Indian history. But whatever it is, this is a long time back. This is in the 70s. It's a long time back. But it does do something. And I want to just take a one point because it has an immediate implication, which is it produces a new emotion, a new revolutionary emotion. And that's where the word Dalit changes drastically. The other day again I was talking to Y.S. Salone and he pointed out that the word Dalit was already there. Pada Dalit, Ambedkar himself, broken man, in his work on Untouchable. Yes, that is true factually, but it is not the same thing. Dalit as a word of universal politics and at the same time Dalit as a factual description of a people. This new synthesis is the product or is the consequence of a rupture which is actually post-Ambedkarite. Now, that does not mean it is not Ambedkarite. It is Ambedkarite, but it is not, it doesn't coincide with Ambedkar's historical sequence or moment. So, the point of revolution and consequence is precisely what we are talking about. The revolution and its consequence don't have to be continuous. There can be discontinuity. But that doesn't make the discontinuity any less revolutionary. So Dalit Panthers is, in a sense, a ruptural historical conjuncture for this revolutionary story. But, of course, immediately the question arises, what is the verification of it? And the verification of it is counter-revolutionary. What does that mean? So I'll not give you a historical, analysis of the time from then to now. It will take too long. But let's come quickly to the present. That is in the last 3-4 years. Bhima Koregaon. Come to Bhima Koregaon. And what do you see happening here with Bhima Koregaon? That is Bhima Koregaon, that the event that happened 2 years back, right? 2 years back. After which there was so much that happened as through the side of the state, so much, which I don't have to talk about. But there is something which specifically happened, which is that a certain diagnostic of Bhima Koregaon the state put out through the media, because the media these days is such a powerful. What was the diagnosis? What was the diagnosis? Why did Bhima Koregaon happen according to the state? And what do you see? You see Bhima Koregaon, which in its provenance, why Bhima Koregaon? It's been happening for the last 200 years because of a specific historical commemoration of something which happened earlier and so on and so forth. And it is entirely to do with the Mahar identity within a particular historical context. But in 2000, was it 16 or 17? I keep confusing. 17, right? 2017, of course. In 2017, what becomes Bhima Koregaon's diagnostic category? Naxalism, Maoism. Now, whether it is true or not, it's forensic truth, I'm not getting it. But one thing has happened, no? The word Dalit has been more or less, it has been rendered invisible. So, from the state side, the diagnostic category, which determines dominant discourse on Bhima Koregaon today, that is Bhima Koregaon as an event, is counter-revolutionary. Because, why? Because in the dominant imaginary of mainstream India, the name of revolution, and revolution is a problematic idea for mainstream India, is Maoism. And I don't mean revolution in some heightened enthusiastic, revolution in the official sense. Who are the Marxist revolutionaries who carry on a policy of violence which is both terroristic and also archaic? The Maoists. What is Bhima Koregaon? It is a kind of fallout of that on a civic public life. But what is Bhima Koregaon, if one were to ask, not from this kind of presumptuous discourse, but if one were to ask the rational scientific question, that what is Bhima Koregaon as it happened, in what it was, with whatever conjunctural, long-term, political, religious, everything you can bring in, then you would need an analysis which had to be autonomous, not in the sense of simply Dalit autonomy or some other autonomy, but the autonomy of the event itself, the singularity, the fact that it took place. Why did it not take place forever? Why didn't it take place 10 years back? It has been going on for so many years. That it took place at a particular historical moment needs to be taken on and analyzed. In a way, the state blocked that analysis by labeling it through the official name of the revolution. So you see, when urban Naxalism and Maoism and so on and so forth become the very label on which Bhima Koregaon is plastered, then two things happen. One is that the question of the counter-revolution which the state represents is today, in a sense, becomes something which becomes not a question of something which happens in history, nor a question of something which goes into the philosophical reality, or not the reality, the philosophical thinking of revolution or its opposite, counter-revolution and so on. What it becomes is, it becomes a matter of classification. So revolution is not anymore the idea of revolution. Revolution is a party and a certain region. It is a security question. And Bhima Koregaon has been inserted into a security question. This is what has happened clearly between the state and the media in the last 1 or 2 years with Bhima Koregaon. Now, it's a different matter that after Bhima Koregaon happened, I was told by people in Bombay that a lot of Dalit activists were interrogated or picked up much before the others were arrested. Now, I'm not getting into those factual questions because those are things that you need to take data and talk about it. So but there was a separation made between its so-called its immediate historical reality and this larger administration through official classification, which is now called urban Naxalism or Naxalism and Maoism and so on and so forth. That is one. The second thing is, of course, what it does is, in general, it makes the Dalit someone, again, within the scales of the revolutionary subjects, or the subjects of the revolution, it again makes the question of a Dalit revolutionary potential into a relatively less developed, a relatively naive, a relatively unsophisticated political source in comparison to the more hegemonic idea of revolution, which is dominated by the left. In a way, the state confirms the left's hegemonic position. Yeah? Which doesn't mean that we have to immediately get into saying that the Dalit revolution is as kind of powerful or sophisticated as the left's idea of revolution. So that is not the point. The point is that all of this is happening through the state. It is happening through what I am calling the counter-revolutionary mechanisms or verifications. But precisely because of these moves, discursive, administrative, militaristic, securitarian and so on of the state, in a way, it verifies that something is going on which cannot be historically factually marked or demonstrated, but something whose existence can be hypothesized, which I am calling the revolutionary hypothesis. Whether someone wants to claim that that revolutionary hypothesis includes the Dalit revolution, I do, is not really the issue today. But what I am saying is, the state, through its official documents, through its actions, and also its kind of rough and tumble philosophy, brutal police philosophy in a way, verifies the possible existence of a revolutionary hypothesis. So finally, if we jump from there to the present situation in the sense of today as in here and now, and take the elections that have happened recently, and the analysis that are being made of the present elections, then what you find is that in the present elections, on the one hand, you have a very clear sense of the victory or the triumph of a majority which is clearly a majority defined in terms of a particular religious numbers, which is the numbers of Hindus. But you also find a certain kind of majority which is defined in terms of whether Hindu or not, but in terms of individuals who are broken out from their otherwise erstwhile communitarian groupings. Two kinds of majorities are actually being talked about. So Ambedkar had already in 1946 spoken of a communal majority, which is a majoritarian majority, Hindu majoritarian majority. But recently Faisal Devji has spoken of what he calls a national modern majority, or a national majority. What does that mean? It means, how come it seems we just go by things as they are? What happened behind EVM and all that, let's not get into. It seems that people did not vote according to expected, anticipated community lines. So in that sense, are these elections in a sense an indication that the older the subjective collectives like Dalit collective, this new emotion, Dalit is a new emotion, which state in a way was already trying to block by a kind of official revolution, by making it a neutral administrative category, has actually been internalized partly by the very people who carried that new emotion, by their not voting according to certain expected community lines in different places, UP and so on. Would that be a possible way of looking at this new majority? And if it is, then how to think about it? So Faisal Devji would say, you think about it in this way, that when people break out from their communities, then they take up this position of the atomistic modern individual, who is now more and more thinking of himself or herself in an economistic line, that I am not political, I am someone who aspires. It's an aspirational idea, that I aspire as an individual to do well in life, to get a job, to take care of my family, to be happy. But happiness itself is here interesting, because it's a different idea of happiness. Even Ambedkar, like I said earlier in the last talk, spoke of happiness, but happiness which happens through emancipation. But here, happiness which is a fulfillment of aspiration. So in that sense, breaking out of community through this kind of subjective separation, that now you identify subjectively also, not as a Dalit, not as a particular kind of a social or political subject, but as a neutral individual with a neutral capacity for happiness in the aspirational sense, which is an economistic idea basically. So is this election in a way again a verification of the revolutionary, not hypothesis merely, but partly the philosophical defeat of the hypothesis? Because the permanent majority of a communal majority would be, in a sense, a hypothesis which would only be a verification, not so much of a revolutionary hypothesis, but of the futility of any democracy in India. It is, Ambedkar said this very clearly, that as such, given this society, democracy is futile, because people are sooner or later going to vote along communal lines. Now, of course, what we have here is more complicated, because long history of elections in India, you cannot say people have voted along the same lines throughout. People have voted in many different ways and arrived at many different results. But the point is so what is the idea? The idea is elections are a political manifestation of also within civic politics and constitutional politics some chance combinations. So because of a certain election that a particular party, majoritarian party comes, doesn't mean that country has become majoritarian. Sure. But once the party has come through chance, through that particular set of circumstances, is it possible that that party will now produce a subjective discourse? So again I emphasize a subjective discourse that now finally you have done what you were always meant to do. So it is not that it is communal simply in the sense that it is just communal as it is. No. But that the communal potential is reactivated in society. Because in society, the revolutionary change has not been effectuated. It has not been effective. So with all the changes which are partial, essentially the communal potential is in a sense revitalized. So people are subjectively made to and ideologically made to believe that this was the only true election. Till now all elections were only an excuse for this election. Hence the one election. So when we have one nation, one election, I think of one election in a somewhat different way. It's not merely a state center question. It's a question of the one election as an idea. That there is only one election. So this is a peculiar turnaround of the idea of the permanent revolution in Proudhon to Trotsky. Now we have in India this new great thought of the permanent election as a kind of caricatural but counter-revolutionary idea. And certain elections, the last two elections, in a way, are a historical opportunity to try out an idea of the permanent election or the one election, which continues to just repeat and affirm its result. But again, this should not be misunderstood. This doesn't show that this is the univocal fact of the situation. It shows that this is a project which is sought to be imposed. But insofar as this is the project, it also shows that it is a backlash to something which remains the thought of a radical revolutionary hypothesis. So it is not that the Dalit movement is not a reference, but an election with surely formidable consequences. An election, in a sense, is a counter-revolutionary occasion to produce a discourse, to produce a set of moves, to try to make it appear as if the past has now been cancelled, and now with this election a new past has been, a new perpetual present is to be continued. But that is, again, that is only a move, that is only an image, it is an imaginary project for which elections provide a real opportunity, that's all. So election is neither the measure of politics nor the final word on politics. But yes, election is definitely an occasion to make a political project come into force, which has come into force. So this means neither is the election a fraud simply on this account, nor is the election the final truth. But yes, the election is a specific occasion for a certain counter-revolutionary assault, a backlash. But the more violent and more insidious the backlash, in a sense, the more the revolutionary hypothesis is animated, paradoxically. So this is something which is at present today seems to me to be a very real but very ambiguous, equivocal kind of a space in which we are gathered here. So that's why subjectively I am neither in favor of weeping over the results of the last election, nor of course celebrating it. But I do think it is an occasion for thinking about politics today, but not just in terms of today, but in terms of also yesterday and the other yesterdays of yesterday. I think that is enough for now. Thank you very much.
The alternative, as I think, is some kind of communism.